His state of mind was intelligible. Before an hour had elapsed, his fate would be settled. Before an hour, he would know if it were possible to reach some inhabited portion of the continent. Already Godfrey, reasoning on what had been the route followed and the way made by the dream during a navigation of 17 days, had concluded that it could only be on the Japanese or Chinese coast that the ship had gone down. Besides, the position of the sun, always in the south, rendered it quite certain that the dream had not crossed the line. 2 hours after he had started, Godfrey reckoned the distance he had traveled at about 5 miles, considering several circuits which he had had to make owing to the density of the forest. The second group of hills could not be far away. Already the trees were getting farther apart from each other, forming isolated groups, and the rays of light penetrated more easily through the lofty branches. The ground began slightly to slope, and then abruptly to rise. Although he was somewhat fatigued, Godfrey had enough will not to slacken his pace. He would doubtless have run had it not been for the steepness of the earlier ascents. He had soon got high enough to overlook the general mass of the verdant dome which stretched away behind him, and whence several heads of trees here and there emerged. But Godfrey did not dream of looking back. His eyes never quitted the line of the denuded ridge, which showed itself about 400 or 500 feet before and above him. That was the barrier which all the time hid him from the eastern horizon. A tiny cone, obliquely truncated, overlooked this rugged line and joined on with its gentle slope to the sinuous crest of the hills. There, said Godfrey, that is the point I must reach, the top of that cone, and from there what shall I see? A town, a village, a desert. Highly excited, Godfrey mounted the hill, keeping his elbows at his chest to restrain the beating of his heart. His panting tired him, but he had not the patience to stop so as to recover himself. Were he to have fallen half fainting on the summit of the cone, which shot up about 100 feet above his head, he would not have lost a minute in hastening towards it. A few minutes more and he would be there. The ascent seemed to him steep enough on his side, an angle perhaps of 30 or 35 degrees. He helped himself up with hands and feet. He seized on the tufts of slender herbs on the hillside and on a few meager shrubs, mastics and myrtles, which stretched away up to the top. A last effort was made. His head rose above the platform of the cone, and then, lying on his stomach, his eyes gazed at the eastern horizon. It was the sea which formed it. 20 miles off, it united with the line of the sky. He turned round. Still sea, west of him, south of him, north of him, the immense ocean surrounding him on all sides. An island. An island. An island. As he uttered the word, Godfrey felt his heart shrink. The thought had not occurred to him that he was on an island, and yet such was the case. The terrestrial chain, which should have attached him to the continent, was abruptly broken. He felt as though he had been a sleeping man in a drifted boat, who awoke with neither oar nor sail to help him back to shore. But Godfrey was soon himself again. His part was taken to accept the situation. If the chances of safety did not come from without, it was for him to contrive them. He set to work at first then, as exactly as possible to ascertain the disposition of this island, which his view embraced over its whole length. He estimated that it ought to measure about 60 miles round, being, as far as he could see, about 20 miles long from south to north, and 12 miles wide from east to west. Its central part was screened by the green depths of forest, which extended up to the ridge dominated by the cone, whose slope died away on the shore. All the rest was prairie, with clumps of trees, or beach with rocks, whose outer ring was capriciously tapered off in the form of capes and promontories. A few creeks cut out the coast, but could only afford refuge for 2 or 3 fishing boats. The bay at the bottom of which the dream lay shipwrecked was the only one of any size, and that extended over some 7 or 8 miles. An open roadstead, no vessel would have found it a safe shelter, at least unless the wind was blowing from the east. But what was this island? To what geographical group did it belong? Did it form part of an archipelago, or was it alone in this portion of the Pacific? In any case, no other island, large or small, high or low, appeared within the range of vision. Godfrey rose and gazed round the horizon. Nothing was to be seen along the circular line where sea and sky ran into each other. If then there existed to windward or to leeward any island or coast of a continent, it could only be at a considerable distance. Godfrey called up all his geographical reminiscences in order to discover what island of the Pacific this could be. In reasoning it out, he came to this conclusion. The Dream for 17 days had steered very nearly southwest. Now, with a speed of to 180 miles every 24 hours, she ought to have covered nearly 50 degrees. Now it was obvious that she had not crossed the equator. The situation of the island, or of the group to which it belonged, would therefore have to be looked for in that part of the ocean comprised between the 160th nth degrees of west longitude. In this portion of the Pacific, it seemed to Godfrey that the map showed no other archipelago than that of the Sandwich Islands. But outside this archipelago were there not any isolated islands whose names escaped him, and which were dotted here and there over the sea up to the coast of the Celestial Empire? It was not of much consequence. There existed no means of his going in search of another spot on the ocean which might prove more hospitable. "Well," said Godfrey to himself, "if I don't know the name of this island, I'll call it Fina Island. In memory of her I ought never to have left to run about the world, and perhaps the name will bring us some luck." Godfrey then occupied himself in trying to ascertain if the island was inhabited in the part which he had not yet been able to visit. From the top of the cone, he saw nothing which betrayed the presence of aborigines, neither habitations on the prairie nor houses on the skirt of the trees, not even a fisherman's hut on the shore. But if the island was deserted, the sea which surrounded it was none the less so, for not a ship showed itself within the limits of what, from the height of the cone, was a considerable circuit. Godfrey, having finished his exploration, had now only to get down to the foot of the hill and retake the road through the forest so as to rejoin Tartlet. But before he did so, his eyes were attracted by a sort of cluster of trees of huge stature, which rose on the boundary of the prairie towards the north. It was a gigantic group. It exceeded by a head all those which Godfrey had previously seen. "Perhaps," he said, "it would be better to take up our quarters over there, more especially as, if I am not mistaken, I can see a stream which should rise in the central chain and flow across the prairie." This was to be looked into on the morrow. Towards the south, the aspect of the island was slightly different. Forests and prairies rapidly gave place to the yellow carpet of the beach, and in places the shore was bounded with picturesque rocks. But what was Godfrey's surprise when he thought he saw a light smoke which rose in the air beyond this rocky barrier. "Are there any of our companions?" he exclaimed. "But no, it is not possible. Why should they have got so far from the bay since yesterday and round so many miles of reef? Is it a village of fishermen or the encampment of some indigenous tribe?" Godfrey watched it with the closest attention. Was this gentle vapor which the breeze softly blew towards the west a smoke? Could he be mistaken? Anyhow, it quickly vanished. A few minutes afterwards, nothing could be seen of it. It was a false hope. Godfrey took a last look in its direction, and then, seeing nothing, glided down the slope and again plunged beneath the trees. An hour later, he had traversed the forest and found himself on its skirt. There Tartlet awaited him with his 2-footed and 4-footed flock. And how was the obstinate professor occupying himself? In the same way. A bit of wood was in his right hand, another piece in his left, and he still continued his efforts to set them alight. He rubbed and rubbed with a constancy worthy of a better fate. "Well," he shouted as he perceived Godfrey some distance off, "and the telegraph office?" "It is not open," answered Godfrey, who dared not yet tell him anything of the situation. "And the post?" It is shut, but let us have something to eat. I am dying with hunger, we can talk presently. And this morning, Godfrey and his companion had again to content themselves with a too meager repast of raw eggs and shellfish. Wholesome diet, repeated Godfrey to Tartlet, who was hardly of that opinion and picked his food with considerable care. Chapter 11, in which the question of lodging is solved as well as it could be. The day was already far advanced. Godfrey resolved to defer till the morrow the task of proceeding to a new abode, but to the pressing questions which the professor propounded on the results of his exploration, he ended by replying that it was an island, Fina Island, on which they both had been cast, and that they must think of the means of living before dreaming of the means of departing. An island, exclaimed Tartlet. Yes, it is an island, which the sea surrounds. Naturally. But what is it? I have told you, Fina Island, and you understand why I gave it that name. No, I do not understand, answered Tartlet, making a grimace, and I don't see the resemblance. Miss Fina is surrounded by land, not water. After this melancholy reflection, he prepared to pass the night with as little discomfort as possible. Godfrey went off to the reef to get a new stock of eggs and mollusks, with which he had to be contented, and then, tired out, he came back to the tree and soon fell asleep, while Tartlet, whose philosophy would not allow him to accept such a state of affairs, gave himself over to the bitterest meditations. On the morrow, the 28th of June, they were both afoot before the cock had interrupted their slumbers. To begin with, a hasty breakfast, the same as the day before. Only water from a little brook was advantageously replaced by a little milk given by one of the goats. Ah, worthy Tartlet, where were the mint julep, the port wine sangaree, the sherry cobbler, the sherry cocktail, which he hardly drank, but which was served him at all hours in the bars and taverns of San Francisco? How he envied the poultry, the agoutis, and the sheep, who cheerfully quenched their thirst without the addition of such saccharine or alcoholic mixtures to their water from the stream. To these animals, no fire was necessary to cook their food. Roots and herbs and seeds sufficed, and their breakfast was always served to the minute on their tablecloth of green. Let us make a start, said Godfrey. And behold the two on their way, followed by a procession of domestic animals who refused to be left behind. Godfrey's idea was to explore, in the north of the island, that portion of the coast on which he had noticed the group of gigantic trees in his view from the cone. But to get there, he resolved to keep along the shore. The surf might perhaps have cast up some fragment of the wreck. Perhaps they might find on the beach some of their companions in the dream to which they could give Christian burial. As for finding any one of them living, it was hardly to be hoped for after a lapse of 36 hours. The first line of hills was surmounted, and Godfrey and his companion reached the beginning of the reef, which looked as deserted as it had when they had left it. There they renewed their stock of eggs and mollusks, in case they should fail to find even such meager resources away to the north. Then, following the fringe of seaweed left by the last tide, they again ascended the dunes and took a good look round. Nothing, always nothing. We must certainly say that if misfortune had made Crusoes of these survivors of the dream, it had shown itself much more rigorous towards them than towards their predecessors, who always had some portion of the vessel left to them, and who, after bringing away crowds of objects of necessity, had been able to utilize the timbers of the wreck. Victuals for a considerable period, clothes, tools, weapons, had always been left them with which to satisfy the elementary exigencies of existence. But here there was nothing of all this. In the middle of that dark night, the ship had disappeared in the depths of the sea, without leaving on the reefs the slightest traces of its wreck. It had not been possible to save a thing from her, not even a lucifer match, and to tell the truth, the want of that match was the most serious of all wants. I know well, good people comfortably installed in your easy chairs before a comfortable hearth, at which is blazing brightly a fire of wood or coals, that you will be apt to say. But nothing was more easy than for them to get a fire. There are 1,000 ways of doing that. 2 pebbles, a little dry moss, a little burnt rag, and how do you burn the rag? The blade of a knife would do for a steel, or two bits of wood rubbed briskly together in Polynesian fashion. Well, try it. It was about this that Godfrey was thinking as he walked, and this it was that occupied his thoughts more than anything else. Perhaps he too, poking his coke fire and reading his traveller's tales, had thought the same as you good people. But now he had to put matters to the test, and he saw with considerable disquietude the want of a fire, that indispensable element which nothing could replace. He kept on ahead, then lost in thought, followed by Tartlet, who by his shouts and gestures kept together the flock of sheep, agouties, goats, and poultry. Suddenly his look was attracted by the bright colors of a cluster of small apples which hung from the branches of certain shrubs, growing in hundreds at the foot of the dunes. He immediately recognized them as manzanillas, which serve as food to the Indians in certain parts of California. At last, he exclaimed, there is something which will be a change from our eggs and mussels. What, do you eat those things? Said Tartlet with his customary grimace. You shall soon see, answered Godfrey. And he set to work to gather the manzanillas and eat them greedily. They were only wild apples, but even their acidity did not prevent them from being agreeable. The professor made little delay in imitating his companion and did not show himself particularly discontented at the work. Godfrey thought, and with reason, that from these fruits there could be made a fermented liquor which would be preferable to the water. The march was resumed. Soon the end of the sand dunes died away in a prairie traversed by a small stream. This was the one Godfrey had seen from the top of the cone. The large trees appeared further on, and after a journey of about 9 miles, the two explorers, tired enough by their 4 hours' walk, reached them a few minutes after noon. The sight was well worth the trouble of looking at, of visiting, and doubtless occupying. On the edge of a vast prairie, dotted with manzanilla bushes and other shrubs, there rose a score of gigantic trees which could have even borne comparison with the same species in the forests of California. They were arranged in a semicircle. The carpet of verdure which stretched at their feet, after bordering the stream for some hundreds of feet, gave place to a long beach, covered with rocks and shingle and seaweed, which ran out into the water in a narrowing point to the north. These big trees, as they are commonly called in Western America, belong to the genus Sequoia and are conifers of the fir family. If you ask the English for their distinguishing name, you will be told Wellingtonias. If you ask the Americans, they will reply Washingtonias. But whether they recall the memory of the phlegmatic victor of Waterloo or of the illustrious founder of the American Republic, they are the hugest products known of the Californian and Nevadan floras. In certain districts in these states, there are entire forests of these trees, such as the groups at Mariposa and Calaveras, some of the trees of which measure from 60 to 80 feet in circumference and some 300 feet in height. One of them, at the entrance of the Yosemite Valley, is quite 100 feet round. When living, for it is now prostrate, its first branches could have overtopped Strasbourg Cathedral, or, in other words, were above 80 feet from the ground. Besides this tree there are the mother of the forest, the beauty of the forest, the hut of the pioneer, the 2 sentinels, General Grant, Miss Emma, Miss Mary, Brigham Young and his wife, the 3 Graces, the bear and C, all of them veritable vegetable phenomena. One of the trees has been sawn across at its base, and on it there has been built a ballroom in which a quadrille of 8 or 10 couples can be danced with ease. But the giant of giants, in a forest which is the property of the state, about 15 miles from Murphy, is the father of the forest, an old sequoia 4,000 years old, which rises 452 feet from the ground, higher than the cross of St. Peter's at Rome, higher than the Great Pyramid of Gizeh, higher than the iron bell turret which now caps one of the towers of Rouen Cathedral, and which ought to be looked upon as the highest monument in the world. It was a group of some 20 of these colossi that nature had planted on this point of the island, at the epoch, probably, when Solomon was building that temple at Jerusalem which has never risen from its ruins. The largest was, perhaps, 300 feet high, the smallest nearly 200. Some of them, hollowed out by age, had enormous arches through their bases, beneath which a troop of horsemen could have ridden with ease. Godfrey was struck with admiration in the presence of these natural phenomena, as they are not generally found at altitudes of less than 4 to 6,000 feet above the level of the sea. He even thought that the view alone was worth the journey. Nothing he had seen was comparable to these columns of clear brown, which outlined themselves almost without sensible diminution of their diameters to their lowest fork. The cylindrical trunks, rising 4 to 100 feet above the earth, ramified into such thick branches that they themselves looked like tree stems of huge dimensions, bearing quite a forest in the air. One of these specimens of Sequoia gigantea, one of the biggest in the group, more particularly attracted Godfrey's attention. Gazing at its base, it displayed an opening of from 4 to 5 feet in width and 10 feet high, which gave entrance to its interior. The giant's heart had disappeared, the alburnum had been dissipated into soft whitish dust. But if the tree did not depend so much on its powerful roots as on its solid bark, it could still keep its position for centuries. In default of a cavern or a grotto, said Godfrey, here is a ready-made dwelling, a wooden house, a tower, such as there is in no inhabited land. Here we can be sheltered and shut in. Come along, Tartlet, come. And the young man, catching hold of his companion, dragged him inside the sequoia. The base was covered with a bed of vegetable dust, and in diameter could not be less than 20 feet. As for the height to which its vault extended, the gloom prevented even an estimate, for not a ray of light found its way through the bark wall. Neither cleft nor fault was there through which the wind or rain could come. Our two Crusoes would therein find themselves in a position to brave with impunity the inclemency of the weather. No cave could be firmer or drier or compacter. In truth, it would have been difficult to have anywhere found a better. Tartlet, what do you think of our natural house? Asked Godfrey. Yes, but the chimney, answered Tartlet. Before we talk about the chimney, replied Godfrey, let us wait till we have got the fire. This was only logical. Godfrey went to reconnoiter the neighborhood. As we have said, the prairie extended to this enormous mass of sequoias which formed its edge. The small stream meandering through the grassy carpet gave a healthy freshness to its borders, and thereon grew shrubs of different kinds, myrtles, mastic bushes, and among others a quantity of manzanillas, which gave promise of a large crop of their wild apples. Farther off, on ground that grew gradually higher, were scattered several clumps of trees, made up of oaks and beeches, sycamores and nettle trees, but trees of great stature as they were, they seemed but simple underwood by the side of the mammoths, whose huge shadows the sun was throwing even into the sea. Across the prairie lay minor lines of bushes and vegetable clumps and verdant thickets, which Godfrey resolved to investigate on the following day. If the sight pleased him, it did not displease the domestic animals. Agouties, goats, and sheep had soon taken possession of this domain, which offered them roots to nibble at and grass to browse on far beyond their needs. As for the fowls, they were greedily pecking away at the seeds and worms in the banks of the rivulet. Animal life was already manifesting itself in such goings and comings, such flights and gambols, such bleatings and gruntings and cluckings as had doubtless never been heard of in these parts before. Then Godfrey returned to the clump of sequoias and made a more attentive examination of the tree in which he had chosen to take up his abode. It appeared to him that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to climb into the first branches, at least by the exterior, for the trunk presented no protuberances. Inside it, the ascent might be easier if the tree were hollow up to the fork. In case of danger, it would be advisable to seek refuge among the thick boughs borne by the enormous trunk, but this matter could be looked into later on. When he had finished his inquiries, the sun was low on horizon, and it seemed best to put off till tomorrow the preparations for their definitely taking up their abode. But after a meal with dessert composed of wild apples, what could they do better than pass the night on a bed of the vegetable dust which covered the ground inside the sequoia? And this, under the keeping of Providence, was what was done, but not until after Godfrey, in remembrance of his uncle, William W. Colderup, had given to the giant the name of Will Tree, just as its prototypes in the forests of California and the neighboring states bear the names of the great citizens of the American Republic. Chapter 12, which ends with a thunderbolt. It must be acknowledged that Godfrey was in a fair way to become a new man in this completely novel position to one so frivolous, so light-minded, and so thoughtless. He had hitherto only had to allow himself to live. Never had care for the morrow disquieted his rest. In the opulent mansion in Montgomery Street, where he slept his 10 hours without a break, not the fall of a rose leaf had ever troubled his slumbers. It was so no longer. On this unknown land, he found himself thoroughly shut off from the rest of the world, left entirely to his own resources, obliged to face the necessities of life under conditions in which a man even much more practical might have been in great difficulty. Doubtless, when it was found that the dream did not return, a search for him would be made. But what were these two? Less than a needle in a hayrick or a sand grain on the sea bottom. The incalculable fortune of Uncle Colderup could not do everything. When Godfrey had found his fairly acceptable shelter, his sleep in it was by no means undisturbed. His brain traveled as it had never done before. Ideas of all kinds were associated together, those of the past, which he bitterly regretted, those of the present of which he sought the realization, those of the future which disquieted him more than all. But in these rough trials, the reason and, in consequence, the reasoning which naturally flows from it, were little by little freed from the limbo in which they had hitherto slept. Godfrey was resolved to strive against his ill luck, and to do all he could to get out of his difficulties. If he escaped, the lesson would certainly not be lost on him for the future. At daybreak he was astir, with the intention of proceeding to a more complete installation. The question of food, above all that of fire, which was connected with it, occupied the first place. Then there were tools or arms to make, clothes to procure, unless they were anxious of soon appearing attired in Polynesian costume. Tartlet still slumbered. You could not see him in the shadow, but you could hear him. That poor man, spared from the wreck, remained as frivolous at 45 as his pupil had formerly been. He was a gain in no sense. He even might be considered an incubus, for he had to be cared for in all ways, but he was a companion. He was worth more in that than the most intelligent dog, although he was probably of less use. He was a creature able to talk, although only at random, to converse, if the matter were never serious, to complain, and this he did most frequently. As it was, Godfrey was able to hear a human voice. That was worth more than the parrots in Robinson Crusoe. Even with a tartlet he would not be alone, and nothing was so disheartening as the thought of absolute solitude. Crusoe before Friday, Crusoe after Friday, what a difference, thought he. However, on this morning, that of June 29th, Godfrey was not sorry to be alone, so as to put into execution his project of exploring the group of sequoias. Perhaps he would be fortunate enough to discover some fruit, some edible root, which he could bring back, to the extreme satisfaction of the professor. And so he left Tartlet to his dreams and set out. A light fog still shrouded the shore and the sea, but already it had commenced to lift in the north and east under the influence of the solar rays, which little by little were condensing it. The day promised to be fine. Godfrey, after having cut himself a substantial walking stick, went for 2 miles along that part of the beach which he did not know, and whose return formed the outstretched point of Fina Island. There he made a first meal of shellfish, mussels, clams, and especially some capital little oysters, which he found in great abundance. If it comes to the worst, he said to himself, we need never die of hunger. Here are thousands of dozens of oysters to satisfy the calls of the most imperious stomach. If Tartlet complains, it is because he does not like mollusks. Well, he will have to like them. Decidedly, if the oyster did not absolutely replace bread and meat, it furnished an aliment in no whit less nutritive, and in a condition capable of being absorbed in large quantities. But as this mollusk is of very easy digestion, it is somewhat dangerous in its use, to say nothing of its abuse. This breakfast ended, Godfrey again seized his stick and struck off obliquely towards the southeast, so as to walk up the right bank of the stream. In this direction, he would cross the prairie up to the groups of trees observed the night before beyond the long lines of shrubs and underwood, which he wished to carefully examine. Godfrey then advanced in this direction for about 2 miles. He followed the bank of the stream, carpeted with short herbage and smooth as velvet. Flocks of aquatic birds noisily flew round this being, who, new to them, had come to trouble their domain. Fish of many kinds were seen darting about in the limpid waters of the brook, here about some 4 or 5 yards wide. It was evident that there would be no difficulty in catching these fish, but how to cook them, always this insoluble question. Fortunately, when Godfrey reached the first line of shrubs, he recognized 2 sorts of fruits or roots. One sort had to pass through the fiery trial before being eaten, the other was edible in its natural state. Of these 2 vegetables, the American Indians make constant use. The first was a shrub of the kind called camas, which thrives even in lands unfit for culture. With these onion-like roots, should it not be found preferable to treat them as potatoes, there is made a sort of flour very rich and glutinous. But either way, they have to be subjected to a certain cooking or drying. The other bush produces a species of bulb of oblong form, bearing the indigenous name of yamph, and if it possesses less nutritive principles than the camas, it is much the better for one thing: it can be eaten raw. Godfrey, highly pleased at his discovery, at once satisfied his hunger on a few of these excellent roots, and not forgetting Tartlett's breakfast, collected a large bundle, and throwing it over his shoulder, retook the road to Wiltree. That he was well received on his arrival, with the crop of yamps need not be insisted on. The professor greedily regaled himself, and his pupil had to caution him to be moderate. "Ah," he said, "we have got some roots today. Who knows whether we shall have any tomorrow?" "Without any doubt," replied Godfrey, "tomorrow and the day after and always. There is only the trouble of going and fetching them." "Well, Godfrey, and the camas?" "Of the camas we will make flour and bread when we have got a fire." "Fire!" exclaimed the professor, shaking his head. "Fire, and how shall we make it?" "I don't know yet, but somehow or other we will get at it." "May heaven hear you, my dear Godfrey, and when I think that there are so many fellows in this world who have only got to rub a bit of wood on the sole of their boot to get it, it annoys me. No, never would I have believed that ill luck would have reduced me to this state. You need not take 3 steps down Montgomery Street before you will meet with a gentleman, cigar in mouth, who thinks it a pleasure to give you a light, and here. Here we are not in San Francisco, Tartlett, nor in Montgomery Street, and I think it would be wiser for us not to reckon on the kindness of those we meet. But why is cooking necessary for bread and meat? Why did not nature make us so that we might live upon nothing?" "That will come, perhaps," answered Godfrey with a good-humored smile. "Do you think so?" "I think that our scientists are probably working out the subject." "Is it possible? And how do they start on their research as to this new mode of alimentation?" "On this line of reasoning," answered Godfrey, "as the functions of digestion and respiration are connected, the endeavor is to substitute one for the other. Hence the day when chemistry has made the aliments necessary for the food of man capable of assimilation by respiration, the problem will be solved. There is nothing wanted beyond rendering the air nutritious. You will breathe your dinner instead of eating it, that is all." "Ah, is it not a pity that this precious discovery is not yet made?" exclaimed the professor. "How cheerfully would I breathe half a dozen sandwiches and a silver side of beef, just to give me an appetite." And Tartlett plunged into a semi-sensuous reverie, in which he beheld succulent atmospheric dinners, and at them unconsciously opened his mouth and breathed his lungs full, oblivious that he had scarcely the wherewithal to feed upon in the ordinary way. Godfrey roused him from his meditation and brought him back to the present. He was anxious to proceed to a more complete installation in the interior of Wiltree. The first thing to do was to clean up their future dwelling place. It was at the outset necessary to bring out several bushels of that vegetable dust which covered the ground and in which they sank almost up to their knees. 2 hours' work hardly sufficed to complete this troublesome task, but at length the chamber was clear of the pulverulent bed, which rose in clouds at the slightest movement. The ground was hard and firm, as if floored with joists, the large roots of the sequoia ramifying over its surface. It was uneven but solid. 2 corners were selected for the beds, and of these several bundles of herbage, thoroughly dried in the sun, were to form the materials. As for other furniture, benches, stools, or tables, it was not impossible to make the most indispensable things, for Godfrey had a capital knife, with its saw and gimlet. The companions would have to keep inside during rough weather, and they could eat and work there. Daylight did not fail them, for it streamed through the opening. Later on, if it became necessary to close this aperture for greater safety, Godfrey could try and pierce 1 or 2 embrasures in the bark of the sequoia to serve as windows. As for discovering to what height the opening ran up into the trunk, Godfrey could not do so without a light. All that he could do was to find out with the aid of a pole 10 or 12 feet long, held above his head, that he could not touch the top. The question, however, was not an urgent one. It would be solved eventually. The day passed in these labors, which were not ended at sunset. Godfrey and Tartlet, tired as they were, found their novel bedclothes formed of the dried herbage, of which they had an ample supply, most excellent, but they had to drive away the poultry who would willingly have roosted in the interior of Will Tree. Then occurred to Godfrey the idea of constructing a poultry house in some other sequoia, as to keep them out of the common room, he was building up a hurdle of brushwood. Fortunately, neither the sheep nor the agouties nor the goats experienced the like temptation. These animals remained quietly outside and had no fancy to get through the insufficient barrier. The following days were employed in different jobs, in fitting up the house or bringing in food. Eggs and shellfish were collected, yamf roots and manzanilla apples were brought in, and oysters, for which each morning they went to the bank or the shore. All this took time, and the hours passed away quickly. The dinner things consisted now of large bivalve shells, which served for dishes or plates. It is true that for the kind of food to which the hosts of Will Tree were reduced, others were not needed. There was also the washing of the linen in the clear water of the stream, which occupied the leisure of Tartlet. It was to him that this task fell, but he only had to see to the 2 shirts, 2 handkerchiefs, and 2 pairs of socks, which composed the entire wardrobe of both. While this operation was in progress, Godfrey and Tartlet had to wear only waistcoat and trousers, but in the blazing sun of that latitude the clothes quickly dried. And so matters went on without either rain or wind till July 3rd. Already they had begun to be fairly comfortable in their new home, considering the condition in which they had been cast on the island. However, it was advisable not to neglect the chances of safety which might come from without. Each day Godfrey examined the whole sector of sea which extended from the east to the northwest beyond the promontory. This part of the Pacific was always deserted. Not a vessel, not a fishing boat, not a ribbon of smoke detaching itself from the horizon proclaimed the passage of a steamer. It seemed that Fina Island was situated out of the way of all the itineraries of commerce. All they could do was to wait, trusting in the Almighty who never abandons the weak. Meanwhile, when their immediate necessities allowed them leisure, Godfrey, incited by Tartlet, returned to that important and vexed question of the fire. He tried at first to replace Amadou, which he so unfortunately lacked, by another and analogous material. It was possible that some of the varieties of mushrooms which grew in the crevices of the old trees, after having been subjected to prolonged drying, might be transformed into a combustible substance. Many of these mushrooms were collected and exposed to the direct action of the sun until they were reduced to powder. Then, with the back of his knife, Godfrey endeavored to strike some sparks off with a flint so that they might fall on this substance. It was useless. The spongy stuff would not catch fire. Godfrey then tried to use that fine vegetable dust, dried during so many centuries, which he had found in the interior of Will Tree. The result was equally discouraging. In desperation, he then, by means of his knife and flint, strove to secure the ignition of a sort of sponge which grew under the rocks. He fared no better. The particle of steel, lighted by the impact of the silex, fell on to the substance, but went out immediately. Godfrey and Tartlet were in despair. To do without fire was impossible. Of their fruits and mollusks they were getting tired, and their stomachs began to revolt at such food. They eyed, the professor especially, the sheep, agouties and fowls which went and came round Will Tree. The pangs of hunger seized them as they gazed. With their eyes they ate the living meat. No, it could not go on like this. But an unexpected circumstance, a providential one if you will, came to their aid. In the night of the 3rd of July, the weather, which had been on the change for a day or so, grew stormy, after an oppressive heat which the sea breeze had been powerless to temper. Godfrey and Tartlet, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, were awakened by heavy claps of thunder and most vivid flashes of lightning. It did not rain as yet, but it soon promised to do so, and then regular cataracts would be precipitated from the cloudy zone, owing to the rapid condensation of the vapor. Godfrey got up and went out so as to observe the state of the sky. There seemed quite a conflagration above the domes of the giant trees, and the foliage appeared on fire against the sky, like the fine network of a Chinese shadow. Suddenly, in the midst of the general uproar, a vivid flash illuminated the atmosphere. The thunderclap followed immediately, and Will Tree was permeated from top to bottom with the electric force. Godfrey, staggered by the return shock, stood in the midst of a rain of fire which showered around him. The lightning had ignited the dry branches above him. They were incandescent particles of carbon which crackled at his feet. Godfrey, with a shout, awoke his companion. "Fire, fire!" "Fire," answered Tartlet, "blessed be heaven which sends it to us." Instantly they possessed themselves of the flaming twigs, of which some still burned, while others had been consumed in the flames. Hurriedly, at the same time, did they heap together a quantity of dead wood, such as was never wanting at the foot of the sequoia, whose trunk had not been touched by the lightning. Then they returned into their gloomy habitation, as the rain, pouring down in sheets, extinguished the fire which threatened to devour the upper branches of Will Tree. Chapter 13, in which Godfrey again sees a slight smoke over another part of the island. That was a storm which came just when it was wanted. Godfrey and Tartlet had not, like Prometheus, to venture into space to bring down the celestial fire. It was, said Tartlet, as if the sky had been obliging enough to send it down to them on a lightning flash. With them now remained the task of keeping it. "No, we must not let it go out," Godfrey had said. "Not until the wood fails us to feed it," had responded Tartlet, whose satisfaction showed itself in little cries of joy. "Yes, but who will keep it in?" I will watch it day and night, if necessary," replied Tartlet, brandishing a flaming bough. And he did so till the sun rose. Dry wood, as we have said, abounded beneath the sequoias. Until the dawn Godfrey and the professor, after heaping up a considerable stock, did not spare to feed the fire. By the foot of one of the large trees, in a narrow space between the roots, the flames leapt up, crackling clearly and joyously. Tartlet exhausted his lungs blowing away at it, although his doing so was perfectly useless. In this performance, he assumed the most characteristic attitudes in following the grayish smoke, whose wreaths were lost in the foliage above. But it was not that they might admire it, that they had so longingly asked for this indispensable fire, not to warm themselves at it. It was destined for a much more interesting use. There was to be an end of their miserable meals of raw mollusks and yamf roots, whose nutritive elements, boiling water and simple cooking in the ashes, had never developed. It was in this way that Godfrey and Tartlet employed it during the morning. "We could eat a fowl or two," exclaimed Tartlet, whose jaws moved in anticipation. "Not to mention an agouti ham, a leg of mutton, a quarter of goat, some of the game on the prairie, without counting 2 or 3 freshwater fish and a sea fish or so."